When we look at sports betting markets, we trust that their integrity has not been compromised. We also imagine that we'd be able to tell if they have. But what happens when it's computer games you're betting on?
Hi, I'm Brett Abarbanel, and this is The Knowledge.
Brett Abarbanel is the Director of Research at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas International Gaming Institute. She's also Assistant Professor at the William Harrah Hospitality College at UNLV and an affiliate researcher with the University of Sydney Gambling Treatment and Research Centre, which is part of their School of Psychology. Generally, Brett Abarbanel is someone you want to hang out with. She's a former poker player who grew up by one of the world's most famous racecourses in California and studied mathematics until it took her to Las Vegas. Oh, she's also into eSports.
I play daily. Right now, I play Hearthstone, which I've played for a while. It's a collectible card game, all online. And when it first came out, actually, there was a lot of similarities. A lot of poker players played it because it's a card game that also has some RNG, random number generator functions in it. And then recently, I've been playing a lot of Teamfight Tactics. It's a new game from Riot, which is the producer of or developer for League of Legends. And it's a similar strategy game based on their heroes from the League of Legends series. It's similar to, let's see, how would I even compare that? It's not really a card game. It's sort of like, it's similar to Dota chess, but if you don't play video games, then that comparison might not work very well. You know what it's like? It's kind of like the chess game, that the hologram chess that they play in the Star Wars movies.
It's pretty neat when your hobby and work collide, and esports is high on that agenda for Brett, but she's also got a hell of a lot more going on.
So my general purview is gambling research, as somewhat broad as that sounds. And I cover a lot of different subjects under that, which we do mainly through International Gaming Institute, or IGI. That's my main home. And we do research. Anything underneath the gambling umbrella is something that we would be researching. So we run, for example, the Nevada Problem Gambling Project, which follows people as they go through treatment process for problem gambling. We also do socioeconomic impact studies for gambling in new jurisdictions. Recently, we did one for Japan, for example, as they've opened up gambling in the integrated resort. My main area of expertise is in video games, gambling, and esports, with a particular focus on esports and competition and gambling associated with that. But we also do research in many other areas. We also have a large 4-year research project right now. We've just entered year 3 of that to look at responsible gambling programs and rather specifically a new responsible gambling program that has a big focus on pushing responsible gambling through customer service versus having it as sort of a more generic compliance-based program. So that's been quite interesting as well.
We're going to learn a lot more about Brett Abarbanel and also her most current research project later, but this knowledge starts by delving into her knowledge of esports. If you don't know what esports are, Google International Dota 2 Championships right now and be prepared to be shocked. That is the most valuable prize in esports, with $34 million up for grabs and more than $50 million promised to the winners. To put that into perspective, that's 7 times more than the men's Wimbledon winner or the winner of the Masters in golf. It is really serious business now, so much so that betting on esports has become a multi-billion-dollar market. But with the emergence of betting on esports has come concerns over match fixing and doping.
So my area that I've mainly looked into as sports betting has expanded in the US is how that then applies to esports. Because as I mentioned, a lot of what I've been looking into is gambling and esports. And one of the major things that I've been looking into is match fixing and cheating. So that obviously is a major concern, because when we look at, for example, with traditional sport, the way in which match fixing and cheating takes place, some of it is exactly the same, right? You reach out to an individual or an individual on a team and bribe them to throw a match. That's about as basic form as you can get when it comes to this sort of thing. But how the cheating is done in esports is quite different from how cheating is done in sport, because everything is done online. It's done in a game, and a game that's based on sort of a digital platform as opposed to real life or physical platform. Mesut Ozil is not going to walk out onto the pitch tomorrow and kick a ball 5 times as far as he can today. It's just not sort of how that works in terms of the human body. But if you are able to get into a game, you could add in a few extra lines of code or some sort of add-on into that to allow, let's say, your character who has a hammer to hit or swing that hammer 5 times as hard as it could normally. These kinds of software hacks are very difficult to implement, but it is one example of how something like that might work. Given that a lot of major competition exists on a LAN or a local area network, they're very good at keeping an eye out for that kind of thing. But there's also a lot of competition that exists just in a general online platform. For example, preliminary rounds for different tournaments that are not necessarily part of a major league like Overwatch League or the League of Legends Championship Series, where you might see something like an aimbot. So an aimbot, as an example, is something that I would then install on my computer, and it would intercept packets as they're sent back and forth to the server. And that would allow me, let's say I have a gun that I'm aiming at whatever my competitor is, and the aimbot will automatically aim for, as soon as sort of my gun passes over that other character, it will automatically aim for the head, which is sort of the kill shot in that game, as opposed to hitting in the arm, which might just take away some of the health bar. So that's something that is certainly existent out there. A lot of the different games have functions that search for these sorts of things and then ban players for using them, but they're not 100% perfect. There's other issues. There's certain doping issues that exist in esports, much like they exist in sport. And all of that then comes back to the integrity of not just the sport, but also the betting market, which depends on the integrity of the sport. And that, of course, then can go either way, whether you're cheating to win, for example, like concentration drugs or nootropic type things, or cheating to lose, for example, if you fixed a match.
So there are many layers of deception that can be attempted, from changing code inside the game to trying to influence it with programs on your own computer, and then altering the player's physical state with drugs. Despite this, there are predictions that we might see $12.9 billion bet on esports in 2020. Perceptions are also changing on the gaming phenomenon, with some calling for a move to include esports alongside traditional sports, maybe even at the Olympic Games.
I view it, and I know that others view it differently, I view it as parallel to sport. Obviously, it's quite different, but not every activity necessarily fits within kind of the specific sport area. So there are certainly physical needs for esport. They just may be different from traditional sport. There's also a lot of the psychological and strategy component. Again, sport often holds much of this, but in esport, it's also present in a different capacity. And so that's why I view it in a similar sense. I like the formation of the different esport federations that have started to come up in different places around the world. I know that the EU just pulled together a collection of esport federations. There are a number of different EU members now who have the esport federation for their respective country, and now those have come together to form their own federation. And I think that that is a really good format. It allows people to build based on their knowledge of the games. And so they have that specific expertise that might not exist if you tried to sort of push esports into an existing sport federation, where you're probably going to be met with pushback from folks who don't think it fits, or just people who are in charge who don't know the game, right? It's not necessarily malicious. It may just be ignorance on how some of these games work, which means then that writing rules for organizations around them might not be based on enough knowledge and expertise. I think that we'll see, for example, as esports is integrated, for example, into the upcoming Asia Games, we'll see how that gets, that sort of reaction comes from that. I think that was a really interesting and solid place to start, given how esports and gaming is accepted in Asia as a major part of culture there. I mean, if you look, for example, even going back well over a decade, you can see the photographs of StarCraft competitions in Korea, where it's just so many people that they have to have multiple different screens throughout the audience because people can't see all the way to the front where the first screen is. And it's just incredible. And I think that the acceptance of esports there will really help us see how that then may fit into a broader approach to games and competition, including, of course, traditional sport.
So the 2018 Asian Games ran an exhibition event to great acclaim and have now signed it up as a medal event for 2022. That will be the first step towards integration, and who knows what will happen afterwards. We've talked enough about serious stuff for now, so it's time to take stock of what makes Brett Arbarbinel tick and what it's like to live in Las Vegas. But don't forget, we'll be getting an insight into some pretty interesting changes her responsible gambling research project has found later in the programme.
I love living in Las Vegas. I think that it's, for people who don't live here, I think sometimes there's a misconception that the Strip is everything. And that's just not the case. It is so easy to have a very quiet life in Las Vegas. We have a huge suburban sprawl. And I mean, you can go, oh, you're in the UK, I don't have to convert to kilometers. You can go like 40 miles away from the Strip and still be in kind of the broader Las Vegas area. It's really quite incredible. We're in the middle of a valley, and so it's very easy to access the mountains. You may find T-shirts, for example, sold around town that say like "Ski Las Vegas" because we do get snow up there in the winter. But it really is a neat place to be. There's a lot of interesting stuff. You always have kind of that city atmosphere either in downtown or on the Strip, but it's a different kind of city atmosphere. It's not like going to Manhattan or downtown Chicago or London or any other major metropolitan area. It really is a city that is very focused on tourism. We have other industries, of course, that are here. Technology, solar power, as you might guess, is a big one here. But yeah, it's very focused on tourism, and all the people who really work in these fields had now live in this city. It's grown significantly. When I first moved here in about 2007, the population was about 1 million. And now in 2019, it's 2 million.
It's a funny story how Brett came to live in Las Vegas, and it begins with how her local racetrack first piqued her interest in gambling.
So I am from Del Mar, California. It is a tiny little beach town. The population is about 4,000, maybe 4,500 people. But it's kind of claim to fame, other than its beaches, which are indeed beautiful. I highly recommend everybody go visit. Is a large horse racetrack. So this racetrack sits on the county fairgrounds, actually, and the racetrack takes up about 25% of the land that the city sits on. So it's a huge part of life in Del Mar, even though the races are only on for these days about 10 weeks out of the year. This track opened in, I'm going to get the date wrong, the 30s and 40s, and it was opened by Bing Crosby, the famous actor. And so he even wrote like a jingle about it. It's called "Where the Turf Meets the Surf," because the track really does. It's right up against the water in Del Mar, and because the racetrack was always there, I always had a little bit of an interest in it, much in the same way that I had an interest in the beach or I had an interest in anything else that went on outside my house when I was growing up. So I ended up working there a couple summers when I was at university. I found horse racing really interesting. I actually ended up in my final year at university, and I did my senior thesis on predicting the results of horse races. It was not a particularly good model, but it worked for certain races, mainly claiming races between $5,000 and $40,000. But the model's probably totally outdated by now, so I don't recommend anybody reach out to me to try and use it. And that's just sort of where the interest went from. When I was in my second or third year at school, that was really when the poker craze hit, and I was majoring in statistics. So I had a friend who reached out to me to say, "Oh, you're a young female who's majoring in statistics. May I please teach you poker? And I would love to bankroll you in our poker game." And I said, "Sure." And so I actually ended up, I played it, I loved it. I thought it was so fun. I worked in the math department as a homework grader, which is as boring as it sounds. So I was paid $8 an hour. That was like big money at that time. And and I would take that, and that would then be my bankroll for poker. And I ended up financing like groceries, part of my rent. I met the man who's now my husband, And so when we graduated, we decided, he wanted to be a professional poker player. And I said, okay, well, I have a major in statistics, so I theoretically should be able to get a job in most fields. And luckily, this was before the recession hit. So that was a somewhat accurate statement at the time. And he said, okay, well, if I'm going to do professional poker, for me, the best places to move are LA or Las Vegas. So he left that choice to me. I picked Las Vegas and we moved here, and here's where I am now.
It's now the beginning of year 3 of her 4-year project looking into ways of improving responsible gambling measures. What she brings to this is just building on work she's been doing in this area for many years. So it's useful to learn some of what she's learned in that time before we get the lowdown on where that knowledge is being applied next.
Typical is different for a lot of different people. Typical is not necessarily something that we can apply as a blanket concept to everybody who gambles, because everybody gambles differently. There are some kind of generic assessments that we can make. So when it comes to online gambling, one of the things, since you specifically asked about potential concerns, would be really how your ease of access. So just to make sure that just because you're able to gamble at any time of day and on any different concept or any different event is not necessarily something that you should be doing at all times of day. It might not be a healthy behavior to be able to access anywhere you want at all times. And so I think there are a number of different things that people want to look out for. There are a lot of different tools available, whether it be something that you do yourself. So for example, the most basic thing would be setting a monetary limit. Let's say I don't want to spend more than £100 within a given month. Well, there are a number of different technological tools that I can use, for example, different add-ons or things that might be available directly through an online gambling website. Or it might be something that I do myself and track in an Excel sheet with assessment of my own bank records. So those sorts of behaviors are a way to put a healthy approach on something that might otherwise be a potential concern.
Brett has found that operators are allowing customers to set those limits through their online platforms and also impose self-bans for short to long terms.
One of the really strong benefits of online gambling is access to data, and not just what a consumer has access to, but also what an operator has access to. Because when we do any sort of activity online, it has the potential to be, and I think we've learned recently through the variety of different hearings in governments around the world with companies like Google and Facebook, data is tracked, whether you like it or not. But there can be a lot of benefits that are associated with that too, especially when it comes to things like responsible gambling, because it means we have access to so much more information. The other thing that's really started to come up is what I often call kind of the holy grail of problem in responsible gambling, which is the potential ability for an operator or other third party who has access to data to look for trigger and problem gambling behaviors and potentially assess problem gambling in someone just through what their behavior is through a given site or through a collection of sites. And I emphasize potential collection of sites because if somebody plays extensively and they're playing across a number of different sites, any one given site might not be able to properly assess their behavior because they're only seeing it from one channel. So there are a number of new projects now. One in particular I know, for example, is over on your side of the pond with Ryan Ali and the University of Bournemouth. They're looking at gambling behavior across a number of different betting sites. And so they've been able to put together different algorithms to look at what might constitute unhealthy behavior, and then provide, when the next step, which is possibly even more difficult than the assessment step, is the communication step, because it can be really hard to communicate to somebody that they might have problematic behavior. If you catch somebody too early, then and say, I think you might be gambling in possibly an irresponsible way, people like you typically gamble like this, you might actually be then postponing help-seeking behavior as opposed to getting them at an appropriate time before it becomes a major issue. Or depending on if they're not ready to seek help, though they may need it, you may actually then end up pushing it further down the line, because if you tell somebody they need help and they're not ready to seek help, they'll probably just react in kind of a normal human way, which is to say, no, I don't. Just leave me alone. I don't want to hear this. I'm not ready. Go away. And that may then also postpone help seeking. So through all of this, then the Holy Grail is two-pronged. It's one, the ability to assess, and then two, the ability then to communicate.
How we go about communicating to someone we think might be gambling too much or generally irresponsibly is what Brett's working on right now using MGM's portfolio of North American casinos.
So it's been interesting. Some of the biggest changes that we've seen have actually been on the employee side versus the consumer side. One of the huge things that we're looking at on the consumer side is behavioral change. So if you change how information is presented to people, does it change the way they act and behave? Behavioral change in general, not just gambling behavior, takes a really long time. So the example I always like to give is kids who bite their fingernails. I was one of those. I bit my nails when I was a kid, and it took forever. I think I was 9 years old by the time I finally stopped. And I went through everything, right? All that really terrible tasting nail polish to I think one time my mom, or no, it must have been my aunt, because she was she was the one who could get me to do this stuff. Like, I put soap underneath my nails, I'd bite it and it tastes terrible and miserable. But it still took me easily a year to stop biting my nails. And this is when I was a kid, right? Kids are supposed to learn behaviors quickly. So enacting major behavioral change takes a long time. So right now, we're not necessarily seeing any major changes in behavior other than how people are interacting with the program, and not necessarily yet with their gambling behavior. So just to extrapolate on that a little bit more, the major changes that we're seeing are how people talk to employees, how they use the brochures. So for example, there's printed materials that go out at these casinos. And one of the interesting things that we found was, with this new program, people who pick up those brochures, 85% of them read it, which, I'm going to be honest, I thought was huge. I mean, we're talking about, most of these places are in Las Vegas, or they're in dedicated locations where people go to gamble, and they're still, when you pick up a brochure, they're reading it. I mean, that's really quite impressive. And beyond that, 20% of the people who pick them up actually share them with others. The big area where we really saw a difference then was with employees and how they responded to programs like this. And a big part of that was changing the frame, two big parts really, changing the framing to be more customer service oriented, because these are customer service employees. They are trained to provide service to people who come to them. And so framing responsible gambling in the same way that they frame everything else that they do with customers was really helpful for the employees. A lot of them were reporting that they felt a lot more comfortable talking to gamblers about responsible gambling, because previously, kind of with a generally just compliance-based, provide the information and be done with it, they were worried that if they said the wrong thing, that they might get in trouble at work. Whereas since it's part of customer service provides an employee with a little bit more empowerment to offer help and give things to a customer. So now they felt like they could provide this information, which often includes, set a limit. Don't gamble everything that you have, which kind of seems like it might be in contrast to the traditional message that a gambling operator may send. They felt like they were actually allowed to say this kind of thing to customers, where previously they were worried they might be punished by a supervisor. The other major change that we saw was in the what we call kind of like the diagnosis question. And it's looking for potential signs of issues and problem gambling versus diagnosing somebody with a gambling problem. And again, it started to fit into that customer service approach, wherein the idea with the customer service approach to all things is, if you see somebody that you think doesn't look happy at your service environment, you want to go and offer them help. So again, when you framed potential signs of problem gambling within a framework of offering help and providing service to this customer, employees were a lot more willing and felt more empowered to then go do that thing, as opposed to sort of look at that and maybe put the blinders on or call security and say, okay, well, security will take care of this, which is what they used to do.
This is a big breakthrough in changing the way we treat people in gambling environments, and perhaps there is a way to filter that through to the online space, which seems to be what the researchers in Bournemouth are working on right now. Gambling is recreational entertainment for most people. Responsible gambling measures are all about making sure it stays entertaining and doesn't become stressful and generally not fun. We're in the habit of leaving you with a more philosophical prose to ponder, but this time we've left that to our guest Brett. We asked her, while you're riding the crest of the latest big thing, eSports betting, what do you think will be the big thing in 10 years' time?
This is going to sound kind of like a cop-out answer, that's because it is. I think in 10 years, the biggest thing in gambling will be something that doesn't even exist today, whether that be something where we see gambling kind of getting integrated into other forms of media consumption, sort of like we see right now with video games. Loot boxes are probably the most prolific example of that right now. Or it's going to be something really focused definitely focused in the online space. I think that right now, we're not necessarily going to see, and definitely not in 10 years, we're not going to see casinos disappear. But as general human consumption moves, especially entertainment consumption, moves so much into the online space, we're going to see more and more of that shift into gambling consumption online as well. And we've definitely been seeing that over the last 10 years. Every time you look, for example, at these prevalence studies, you see an increasing number of people who talk about gambling in an online space. And because then we're going to start seeing gambling in an online space, the ability to innovate in that space is significant. And so that's why I say whatever it is that is the big thing in 10 years probably hasn't been thought up yet.
You've been listening to the Knowledge Podcast, brought to you by Gambling.com. To hear new episodes as soon as they're released, make sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify and SoundCloud. Simply search for The Knowledge on your preferred platform. Visit Gambling.com/podcast for full access to our extensive podcast library. To keep up to date with all things gambling, make sure to follow Gambling.com on Twitter @gambling_com.